June 4, 1943. Railroad Street Station, Mexia, Texas. Night was falling across the American plains, but instead of darkness, a sea of light stretched all the way to the horizon. Unofficia Vera Burkhardt, a corporal from Rommel's Africa Corps, held a pencil with trembling hands, scribbling lines that could land him in solitary confinement if discovered. "The Americans must be lying to us," he wrote. "No nation could live in such abundance while fighting on two fronts." Through the train window, he saw farms blazing with light, storefronts still lit at 10 p.m. and streets awash in electricity. In Germany, blackout orders had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, only about 20% of German farms had electricity, while in the United States, the number had already surpassed 90%. While Berlin lay shrouded in darkness for fear of bombs, here, in the rural heart of Texas, light flowed freely, as if the war had never even begun. When 1,850 Africa Corps veterans stepped off the train, they braced for humiliation. Instead, they exited a leather-upholstered Pullman car with sleeping berths and a dining coach draped in white tablecloths. Not a cattle car, not a dark, airless freight box, but a train finer than any they had ridden, even as free soldiers. The people of Mexia had gathered since the afternoon, bringing cakes and lemonade, waving to greet the very men who had once been their enemies. There were no insults, no shouts, only light and a peace so strange it unsettled them. One corporal remembered, "I thought I would be locked in an iron cage, but the first thing they put me in was a train car with leather seats. No humiliation, no darkness, only light. That quiet unsettled them more deeply than the barrel of a gun." Because it spoke of something none of them wanted to admit. The industrial machine here did not tremble before war. It was too vast, too abundant. So much so that war was nothing more than a ripple across the surface of a lake. In a country that Nazi propaganda had called a weak, decaying giant, ordinary people had electricity, cars, and even the leisure to welcome prisoners of war. As the train began to roll deeper into the interior, none of them realized they were stepping into a journey that would shatter every brick of their Nazi worldview. From the glow of that Texas night, they would be led into far greater shocks. Meals more plentiful than any German soldier had ever seen. Prisoner hospitals stocked with medicines unavailable even to German civilians. And colossal factories that in a single day produced more than Germany could in a month. If the nightlights of Mexia had stunned them, what awaited in the coming days would not just break their faith, it would reshape their lives. In May 1943, the North African sun shone down on a scene no German soldier had imagined possible. Desert winds carried the acrid stench of burning oil and scorching sand that seared the skin. The thunder of tank engines had gone silent, replaced by the heavy footsteps of men who once believed themselves invincible. Just months earlier, they had been the proud warriors of the Africa Corps, the army that had pushed the British all the way back to Egypt and earned the respect of Montgomery himself. And now, 250,000 German and Italian troops, including the most battle-hardened desert veterans, stood silently beneath a white flag. It was not a climactic final battle, but a flood of surrenders, as unstoppable as a dam breaking, that ended the Tunisian campaign. In forgotten diary pages, Sergeant Friedrich Radke wrote that most of his comrades still believed this was only a temporary setback. They were convinced Germany was still Europe's unbeatable power, that America, according to propaganda, was merely a colossus with feet of clay, lazy, divided, and weak. Some even joked they would be locked up in filthy pens, just as they had once treated captured Allied soldiers. None of them expected that just weeks later, they would be sitting in cushioned train cars, served steaming hot coffee. An American soldier even apologized because the air conditioning was not working, a level of luxury even German officers had never known. Even in the temporary camp at Oran, the first cracks began to form. They were photographed, issued prisoner ID cards, vaccinated, and briefed on their rights. All in perfect German. Then came the first meal. White bread, meat, real coffee. "We thought it was propaganda," one prisoner wrote. "We did not realize it was just a standard ration." Many stared quietly at the slice of bread in their hands, and, for the first time, wondered, if this was the ration for enemies, what must life be like for Americans themselves? One man whispered, almost unable to believe his own words, "We have misjudged everything. Perhaps Germany is not as strong as we thought." They did not yet know that the shock at Iran was just the overture, because the next battle would not be fought with artillery or tanks, but within their own minds, where every belief would be dismantled not by words, but by the reality they were about to witness. And from that point on, many would no longer be disciples of Hitler, but carriers of the seeds of a new Germany. When the first ship carrying Afrika Korps prisoners docked in Oran, they still clung to the pride they once had. The air around the Algerian port was thick with the scent of salt and diesel smoke. The wail of ship horns echoed through the blazing morning, and the sun poured down so fiercely that the ground burned beneath their worn-out boots. The soldiers who had once roamed across the desert now walked in silence, their shoulders heavier than ever. Many believed this was just a temporary stop before they were locked away in damp, filthy pens, just as Germany had treated its own captives. But from the very moment they set foot on the Algerian shore, an entirely different world unfolded. And piece by piece, their beliefs began to tremble. The American processing of prisoners ran like a massive industrial assembly line. Thousands of men were handled each day, without chaos, without shouting. Each prisoner was photographed and issued an individual identification card. Those who were wounded were taken straight to medical stations, staffed with doctors and nurses. Some were astonished to hear American physicians speaking fluent German, calling them by their names instead of numbers. A few were even handed clean towels and painkillers, things that even German frontline troops had gone without for months. Everyone received medical checkups, vaccinations, and clear explanations of their rights, not barked orders through loudspeakers, but calm, even friendly voices. Many whispered among themselves that it was all theater. Surely the Americans were putting on a show to break their spirit. But then came the first meal, and it struck the first blow to their old worldview. Soft white bread, thick slices of meat, steaming fragrant coffee. Things even German officers had rarely seen in the final months in North Africa. One corporal wrote in his diary, "We thought this was propaganda. We did not realize it was just the standard ration of an American soldier." Quite a few stared at the slice of bread in their hands, as if trying to decipher a foreign language. If this was a meal meant for enemies, what did American soldiers eat every day? If this was how they treated prisoners, then what was life like inside their own country? A lieutenant whispered, almost afraid of his own thoughts. "Maybe we have been wrong about them. From the very beginning." He crushed the slice of bread in his hand until it crumbled, as if grinding down the very beliefs that had carried him through the war. No one spoke another word, but something had cracked in their eyes, something no speech by Goebbels could ever mend. From the scene of a prison camp, Oran had become a psychological laboratory where the first fractures formed, not from whips or propaganda, but from ordinary realities that surpassed all imagination, and they had no idea that those slices of white bread and cups of hot coffee were just the welcome mat. Across the ocean, a series of far greater shocks awaited them. Shocks that would not just break their beliefs, but reshape the way they saw the world forever. November 12, 1942. A blanket of morning fog rolled over the banks of the Richmond River in California, like a curtain rising on a miracle. The clang of metal hammers blended with the flash of welding sparks in the darkness, as the scent of oil and burning steel filled the air. Thousands of workers, many of them former barbers, teachers, or housewives, stood shoulder to shoulder on the shipways, fitting massive steel plates together as if assembling a giant toy. They were not just building ships. They were creating floating factories, silent weapons that would decide the outcome of the war. They were called Liberty ships, and they redefined warfare. In the past, a single cargo ship could take up to 240 days to complete. Even Germany's industry needed 6 to 8 months. But in the United States, by applying Ford-style assembly line thinking and integrating supply chains from 32 states and thousands of subcontractors, a Liberty ship rolled out in just 42 days on average, 5 times faster than the global standard, and they did not do it once. Throughout the war, 2,710 Liberty ships were launched, an average of 3 ships per day, a number that dwarfed the combined shipbuilding capacity of the entire Axis powers. And sometimes, the numbers defied imagination. At the Kaiser shipyard, the SS Robert E. Peary, more than 430 feet long, or about 130 meters, and weighing over 7,000 tons, or about 6,350 metric tons, was completed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The chief engineer wrote in his log, "We could hardly believe it. In the morning, it was just a flat slab of steel. By nightfall, it was floating on water." The news reached even the prisoner of war camps across the ocean. Lieutenant Hans Müller wrote in a letter home, "They build a ship in the time it takes us to repair a boiler. If that is true, then we no longer understand America." In Germany, a transport ship takes 6 to 8 months to leave the yard, and even then, the total number launched each year can be counted on one hand. The unshakable confidence of the Africa Corps began to waver under the weight of such cold, relentless numbers. As U-boats slipped beneath the Atlantic, Liberty ships kept appearing as if rising from the earth itself, carrying tanks, fuel, food, and the full weight of an industrial power that knew no limits. Germany could boast of its engineering, but America had transformed the entire nation into a colossal production line. And if one ship could be built in 4 days, what would happen when an entire people stood behind that assembly line? The answer would not only decide the outcome of the war, it would reshape the global balance of power for the entire 20th century. In the summer of 1943, across the vast Atlantic Ocean, the Liberty ship, SS John Erickson, sliced through the waves toward the eastern coast of the United States. Inside its cramped holds, Africa Corps soldiers sat silently, their eyes fixed on every small detail, as if the world itself were slipping off its familiar axis. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and rusted metal. Every time the hatch opened, the breeze carried with it the scent of grilled meat from the ship's galley, a scent foreign to men accustomed to dry rations and the gnawing hunger of the desert. That smell planted a deep unease in them, as if the world beyond the ship existed on a completely different level. They had lost the battle and surrendered, but nothing could prepare them for the shock waiting on the 2-week voyage across the Atlantic. Sergeant Kurt Zimmerman wrote in his diary, "On the 3rd day, I saw a sailor throw half a steak into the trash. On another morning, we watched them pour an entire barrel of fresh milk into the sea because the ship was overloaded. To us, that was a crime. In Berlin, people waited in line for hours just to receive a few drops of milk for their children. But on this ship, it was just a logistical decision, made without anyone even looking back. The next day, another man dumped out a whole bottle of milk because it had been left out of the refrigerator too long. They did it right in front of us, as if it meant nothing. In the final months in the Tunisian desert, Zimmerman's entire company received less food than what the American sailors discarded in a single day. In Germany, black bread was worth its weight in gold, and coffee was so rare it had to be replaced with roasted grains. Here, half a steak was considered garbage. What Germans saw as priceless, food, electricity, fuel, was so cheap to Americans that they barely noticed it. "We thought they were mocking us," Zimmerman wrote, "but then I realized they were not trying to show off. To them, this was normal. What the prisoners did not know was that behind that wastefulness was a colossal production engine running without pause. Every day, American farms harvested enough wheat to bake tens of millions of loaves of bread. Each year, over 6 billion gallons, or about 22.7 billion liters, of milk were produced. So much that pouring out a few gallons was of no consequence. America's supply chain was nothing like Europe's. It was a fully mechanized network where harvesters did the work of hundreds of men and freight trains hauled millions of tons, or about 907 million kilograms, of grain across the continent. This abundance was not meant to boast. It was the natural result of an industrial system that had turned mass production into second nature. But for prisoners raised in a world of scarcity, that shock was existential. If a nation could throw away what Germany considered a strategic resource, what else had they misunderstood? If food, fuel, and steel could become so meaningless, was victory still within Germany's reach? One soldier stared quietly at a trash bin overflowing with food and whispered, "We do not know whether to be outraged or astonished. Is this arrogance, or is it proof of a world that has never known want? If one person can discard what another would kill to possess, can these two worlds ever truly understand each other? And if this is what they consider excess, what are they keeping for themselves?" They did not know that those discarded crumbs of bread and spilled milk were only an introduction. Because across the ocean, it was not just food, but machinery, energy, and weapons that were pouring forth with the same terrifying abundance. And that was what would melt away every illusion they had about the power of the Nazi state. July 1943. The ship carrying German prisoners left the port of New York and began its long journey across the United States. Inside the quiet train cars, Afrika Korps soldiers stared through the small windows as if hypnotized. The world passing by was unlike anything they had ever known, and with every mile, another piece of their old beliefs was torn away. "We called them degenerates," Sergeant Ernst Keller wrote in his diary. But what I saw through that window made the words sound ridiculous. The train glided past small towns glowing brightly in the summer night. In Europe, war had turned cities into endless darkness. Lights were extinguished to avoid bombs. Streets were desolate. Factories stood silent. But here, endless rows of golden streetlights stretched into the distance, illuminating neighborhoods where children still played ball and shops stayed open late into the night. One soldier whispered, almost afraid of his own words, "If this is a country at war, then where is the war?" As the sun rose, the sights became even harder to believe. Not ruins or refugee camps, but golden fields stretching to the horizon, factories still breathing steady plumes of smoke, and thousands of private cars speeding along newly built highways. For men who had spent their lives in an economy that rationed every drop of fuel, the idea of an ordinary worker driving his own car to work seemed like fiction. "They do not just have enough fuel to move their tanks," one officer wrote. "They have enough to send every single worker to their factory." The greatest shock came when the train stopped in Virginia, where the towering cranes of Norfolk Naval Base rose over the skyline. With more than 14 piers, over 23,000 feet, or about 7,000 meters of docking space, and the capacity to service dozens of warships at once, this base dwarfed Hamburg, the pride of the German Navy, in both scale and capability. A naval engineer taken prisoner wrote home, "We were proud of Hamburg until we saw Norfolk. Here, they do not just repair ships, they build an entire fleet while still fighting. Every turn of the steel wheels carried them deeper into the heart of America, and every passing scene struck like a hammer against the old world view they had brought from Europe. Every steel bridge spanning a river, every neighborhood lit brightly at midnight, every endless line of cars, all spoke a truth that could no longer be denied. This was not a nation exhausted by war. This was a colossal machine that fought, lived, and grew, all at the same time. We called them degenerates, Keller wrote. But what I see is a force that cannot be stopped. And as the train rolled further south, many began to realize that the enemy they had once despised was not just stronger, it was an entirely different world. And this was only the surface of what they were about to witness. Autumn 1943, the sun rose over Michigan's rolling hills through a cold mist, illuminating a massive stretch of steel that reached the horizon. The whistle blew at 6 a.m., and tens of thousands of workers poured through the massive gates of Willow Run, the largest aircraft assembly plant in the world. They were mechanics, farmers who had left their fields, students who had left their studies, even housewives wearing overalls for the first time. In that moment, they were not just working. They were building something no European empire had ever imagined, a factory that could produce a flying fortress in just 63 minutes. Every 63 minutes, a new B-24 Liberator rolled off the assembly line, day after day, for 4 years of war. Willow Run was not an exception. It was a symbol. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, America had turned itself into a vast production engine. In Pittsburgh, the furnaces of Alcoa blazed day and night, pouring out 1.4 million tons, or about 1.27 million metric tons, of aluminum each year, more than the total output of the entire Axis combined. A metal once so rare that an aluminum cutlery set was considered a family heirloom in Europe was now being forged into airplane wings by the ton every hour. In Louisville, Rubber Town sprang up like a new city in just 2 years, producing more than 700,000 tons, or about 635,000 metric tons, of synthetic rubber every year, the lifeblood of trucks, aircraft, and tanks. While Germany struggled with dwindling supplies of natural rubber due to the British naval blockade, these stark numbers, placed side by side, revealed an unbridgeable gap. In 1943, American factories produced more than 86,000 warplanes, over 4 times Germany's total capacity. While German industry struggled to convert civilian lines into military production, the United States had mobilized more than 60% of its GDP for war manufacturing, yet still maintained consumer goods, private cars, and abundant food supplies. A captured German engineer wrote home, "We are not losing because of their guns. We are losing because they can build faster than we can destroy." With every aluminum propeller forged at Alcoa, every tire leaving the Rubbertown line, every airplane taking off from Willow Run, the gap between the two worlds widened. One side believed war was decided by generals and strategists. The other knew victory was shaped by the ceaseless turning of gears in the hearts of its factories. "They do not just have more than we do," a German officer wrote. "They have the ability to create more, faster, forever." And as freight trains carrying thousands of tons, or about 907 million kilograms, of steel, fuel, and machinery rumbled out of factory gates, like blood pumping from a heart through the veins of a body, the prisoners on board began to understand a chilling truth. They were not just looking at the workshop of a single country. They were looking at a machine that generated global power. And the most terrifying part was, it had not yet reached full speed. August 1943, dawn broke over the Mississippi River, golden lights spilling over rippling waters and barges loaded with grain. The distant echo of ship horns hung in the damp air, mingling with the scent of freshly harvested wheat, engine oil, and coal smoke. On deck, Afrika Korps prisoners stood silent, their eyes wide, as if beholding a strange new weapon they had never encountered. Wheat, endless and unstoppable. "We once believed artillery decided wars," Lieutenant Hans Becker wrote in his diary. "But here, I am beginning to understand that bread can bring down an empire." These grain barges were no rare sight. Every day, more than 3 million tons, or about 2.72 million metric tons, of grain moved along the Mississippi, nearly equal to Germany's entire annual wheat production during wartime. On both sides of the river, steel silos as tall as church steeples lined up like fortresses, swallowing truckloads of grain and pouring out streams of it as steady as blood flowing to the front lines. From here, ships packed with wheat, corn, and soybeans departed New Orleans for destinations around the globe. To Britain, the Soviet Union, North Africa, feeding not only American soldiers, but entire Allied armies. This strength came from a quiet revolution the Germans had never imagined: mechanized agriculture. In America, a single McCormick harvester could replace the labor of 100 men. A farm in Iowa, run with tractors and automatic irrigation systems, could produce more food than an entire province in Prussia. While in Germany, horses still pulled plows and young men were conscripted to the front, driving wheat production in 1943 down to just 60% of pre-war levels. In America, yields not only held steady, but increased by 30% in just the first 2 years. Those numbers were beyond the comprehension of the German soldiers on the train. They watched endless fields stretch under the sun, grain elevators rising like cathedral towers, and trains loaded with food crisscrossing the country like a giant circulatory system. And they began to feel something heavy in their chests. "We fight for every loaf of bread," Becker wrote. "They throw bread away like stones into a river. How do you defeat a nation whose very soil fights for them?" The truth was that America was not just sending tanks and planes into battle. It was sending its land itself. Wheat, corn, canned meat, and powdered milk became ammunition that sustained millions of soldiers and allies. And as the barges continued silently down the Mississippi toward the Gulf of Mexico, many prisoners began to understand something deeper. Wars are not won by guns and steel alone, but by something as seemingly ordinary as bread. And if bread itself could become a weapon, what would happen when America unleashed its colossal industrial machines into the war? The answer lay ahead, inside the factories that never slept. Texas, spring of 1944. The rain from the night before had just stopped. Drops of water still clung to the barbed wire stretching for hundreds of yards. A convoy of trucks slowly rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn. Inside were nearly 200 German prisoners, recently arrived at the port of New York after crossing half the world to get here. They were silent. Most were bracing themselves for torture. A prisoner camp on American soil. Everyone pictured shackles, dark cells, and rations handed out in meager handfuls. But instead, the first man who stepped inside just froze, Sergeant Robert Lane recalled. He turned to me and whispered in German, "Are they joking?" Before them stood rows of clean, white-painted wooden barracks. There was electric light at night. The toilets flushed. The showers had hot water. And the kitchen, quite literally, was an industrial kitchen. Long stainless steel tables, steam kettles, dishwashers, and a menu that changed every week. Prisoners were issued Palmolive soap and toothpaste, and even had weekly movie screenings. A German officer wrote in his diary, "I felt ashamed knowing my mother is still cooking on a wood stove through the winter in Hanover, while I, a defeated man, am eating chicken soup in a warm building with hot water." Most German soldiers had grown up on propaganda portraying America as a chaotic land of immigrants, with an immature industry where black people and the poor wandered the streets. But what they saw at Camp Hearn was a model of organization, comfort, and humanity. In a secret survey in 1945, more than 65% of prisoners at Camp Hearn said they would never join the German army again if given the choice. The reason? America followed the Geneva Convention. Yes, but not only that. A declassified memo from the U.S. Office of psychological warfare stated, "We do not need to break the enemy's will with whips. They will question themselves when they see how we treat them in defeat." And indeed, many did. A former SS officer who once commanded in Warsaw admitted bluntly, "I no longer know who the real barbarians are." The final scene of that day. The Texas sun dipped below the hills, bathing the rows of prisoner barracks in orange light. Inside, the sound of a harmonica floated from a corner of the hut. A young German soldier sat writing a letter, his gaze distant. He was telling his mother about the camp, and silently thinking, if this is a prison, then what is left to believe in out there? But the thing that would shake him the most had not yet come. Because the next morning, his name would be called, not for interrogation, but to receive a paid job and a uniform as an American worker. March 1944, Texas. A heavy, humid afternoon hung over prisoner camp number 30. The air felt thick outside the infirmary. But inside, the operating room glowed brightly, and the soft clink of metal instruments echoed through the air. Sergeant Hans Weber, a German artilleryman, lay motionless on the table after injuring his leg in a logging accident. His eyes were fixed on the overhead light, where the silhouette of an American doctor carefully stitched his wound, freshly cleaned with pure penicillin. "I could not believe my eyes," Weber later wrote in his notebook. "They used the most precious drug of our time, on me, a German soldier." At that time, penicillin was still a newly discovered miracle drug, distributed under strict control to the Allied front lines. A single vial of 100,000 units was worth its weight in gold. Yet the Americans used it on prisoners. Not once, but hundreds of times, in camps from Texas to Arkansas. Many German officers could not understand. "Why heal your enemy?" Lieutenant Karl Richter asked in a report sent back to Berlin. He had believed Americans were a barbaric, weak people driven by soft-hearted sentimentality. But that very weakness turned out to be a psychological weapon Germany had never anticipated. Why did they do it? Partly because of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment of prisoners, including medical care. But the deeper, and more dangerous, reason lay in a quiet moral strategy, turning humanity into a weapon. When you use compassion not to surrender but to control, when you make a prisoner ask himself, if the enemy treats me better than my own homeland, have I been fighting for the right cause? At Camp Butner, an American doctor once told a prisoner after treatment, "Get well, because the war will end, and you will have to live with your memories." That sentence, years later, was quoted in the memoir of a former German officer as the turning point that changed his beliefs. The truth was that while Berlin collapsed under bombs and German civilians froze to death without electricity, in America's clean, bright rooms, men who once sought to kill each other now coexisted, not through hatred, but through medicine. And what truly frightened the Germans was not American guns, but the moment they began to hope America would win. October 1944, at the Fort Robinson prisoner camp in Nebraska. Outside, the early winter wind hissed through rows of dry pine trees, while inside, barracks number 7, a German soldier sat motionless on the edge of his bed. His eyes were sunken, his hair uncombed, his uniform wrinkled. His name was Friedrich K., 27 years old, once an SS soldier on the Italian front. Since being captured, he had stopped speaking, refused food, and every morning stared blankly at the shoelace tied around his wrist. Psychologist Charles E. Pierce was the first to notice something was wrong. "He does not need medicine. He needs to believe he still has value," Pierce wrote in an internal U.S. Army report. Pierce began sitting next to Friedrich each morning, saying nothing, just sitting. By the second week, they shared coffee. In the third week, Friedrich spoke his first words, "I deserve to be hanged." Pierce's reply was not forgiveness. It was presence. He enrolled Friedrich in a light work therapy program, caring for horses, painting, writing journals. A month later, Friedrich began talking about dreams of home. where he once played mandolin with his father. "I did not think I could dream anymore," he wrote. This was not an isolated case. By the end of 1945, the U.S. Army had documented more than 3,000 prisoners showing severe depression, nearly 500 of whom had engaged in self-harming behavior. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, a psychological task force was created, made up of doctors, chaplains, and even recovered prisoners supporting one another. They called it the Hospital Without Walls. Amid a world being crushed by bombs, this seemed to defy the logic of war. But for many American officers, it was the only way to preserve the human part of a conflict that was turning people into instruments. "No one can forget what they did in war," one American veteran once said. "But if we can help the enemy not die in despair, then perhaps we are still human." The question that remained was this: when the war ended, would these soldiers, both American and German, carry wounds deeper than any bullet? July 1944, amid endless cornfields in the state of Iowa, beads of sweat rolled down the forehead of Heinrich Vogel, a German prisoner of war who had once worked as a railway laborer in the Ruhr. In front of him stood something he had never seen in his life: a gleaming John Deere Model A combine harvester, as massive as a locomotive, devouring rows of corn in seconds. "Back home, we could harvest less than 2.5 acres, or about 1 hectare, by hand in a full day," he recalled later. Here, in just 1 hour, that machine did a week's worth of work. Heinrich was not the only one overwhelmed. During the 1944 harvest season, more than 50,000 German prisoners were assigned to work on American farms, from Texas to Nebraska. They were not treated as slaves, but as temporary laborers. Each was paid 80 cents a day, given a lunch break, a hot meal, and sometimes even the local newspaper to read. But what stunned them was not the kindness. It was the efficiency. A typical American farmer owned 500 acres, or about 200 hectares, 3 harvesters, 2 trucks, and a mechanized irrigation tank. Their average wheat yield was 3 times that of farms in Bavaria. In a letter sent back to Germany, prisoner Franz M. wrote, "Farmers here live in 2-story brick houses with their own cars and radios. I used to think only aristocrats could live like this." It was no accident. In 1943, the U.S. government invested over $2 billion in mechanized agriculture, a figure far greater than the entire military budget of many nations. From 1941 to 1945, American agricultural output rose by more than 30%, even as manpower declined due to conscription. That was the power of machines, of oil, and of an economy that never stopped expanding. For German officers who had believed in the technological superiority of the Third Reich, this experience was a shock. They realized that total war was not only about bombs and tanks, it was about the ability to feed a population, distribute fuel, and harvest millions of tons. Or about 907 million kilograms of wheat right on schedule. By the end of 1945, many prisoners could recite the efficiency ratings of international harvester tractors, or explain how an automated silo worked. But some could never forget the feeling of standing on that foreign soil for the first time, where a farmer could defeat an empire with nothing but a single harvest. What would happen when these soldiers returned home, carrying memories not of bombs and bullets, but of fields that stretched beyond anything they had ever imagined? September 1944, a group of German prisoners was taken to the industrial district of Camden, New Jersey. They were not led into a barracks or a farm as usual, but into a food factory. Campbell's Soup Company, the deep red sign hanging above the plant read, hardly seemed threatening. But what they witnessed inside left many of them silent for days. Franz H., once a mechanical engineer in Dresden, recalled, "I saw canning lines that ran almost without people. There were conveyor belts more than 330 feet long, or about 100 meters, where vegetables were peeled, cooked, seasoned, and sealed. all within minutes. They could not believe that a food industry could reach such a level of mechanization. In Germany, women were still standing in communal kitchens, slicing potatoes by hand. In Camden, machines had replaced entire kitchen teams. But the bigger shock was not the machinery. It was the people. Another German soldier, Paul M., wrote in his diary, "There was a black woman supervising an entire production unit. I thought I was seeing things. But no, she was directing more than 30 workers, both white and black." In the rigid social hierarchy they had brought from Europe, this was beyond comprehension. They also saw 15 and 16-year-olds welding metal, driving forklifts, and checking steam pressure. No one was stopped by their background or their age. After Camden, they were taken to the River Rouge steel plant, Ford's city within a factory. There they saw a fully integrated assembly line, from raw iron ore to a finished automobile, all in just 30 hours. One prisoner exclaimed, "They are not just producing faster, they believe that everyone can take part." With more than 120,000 workers laboring around the clock, including women and African Americans, River Rouge was not just an industrial powerhouse, but a social statement. The presence of groups the Nazis had despised, women, people of color, teenagers, turned out to be America's secret weapon in mobilizing its full strength. When every pair of hands was put into motion, output did not just double, it tripled, even quadrupled. One prisoner wrote, "I once thought freedom was a soft, indulgent luxury, but perhaps it is the very reason they are unbeatable." 3 days after the River Rouge visit, the trucks carrying the prisoners rolled out once again. But this time, there were no German marching songs, only the steady rumble of engines, and a single silent question running through their minds. If they can turn kitchens and factories into mechanical symphonies like this, what can this America not do? Night, December 24th, 1943. Snow-blanketed Compound 7 at the Hearn prisoner camp in Texas. The cold wind howled through rows of barbed wire, but inside Barracks 14, a warm yellow light still glowed. A young German soldier, Obergefreiter Karl Müller, sat by the fireplace, carefully unfolding letters from home. A letter from his mother in Hamburg, censored and stamped by the U.S. Army, still carried the scent of damp paper and faded perfume. "My dear son," she wrote in trembling handwriting, "hold on to your faith, no matter where you are on enemy soil. I pray for you every day." Outside, a group of prisoners had built a small Christmas tree out of scavenged pine branches, decorated with cut-up newspaper and tin can lids. An American soldier approached. He carried a cardboard box filled with cookies, dried fruit, a few packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and several boxes of colored pencils. Christmas gifts from the Red Cross. He said nothing, just smiled, set the box down, and walked away silently. That night, in the prison compound, German prisoners sang carols in their native tongue. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Their voices drifted into the cold night air, gentle, piercing, and full of emotion. The American sergeant on night duty wrote in his journal, "I did not understand the words they sang, but it was the first time I felt that we and they were not so different." Amid the war, with guns still firing across Europe, Christmas Eve in Texas became something that transcended the battlefield. One prisoner later wrote after the war, "I was given a gift by an American soldier, a man who could have killed me in Europe, but shared his bread with me in Texas." They no longer believed in Nazi ideology, but that night, in the warm glow of lights, among songs and cookies, their faith collapsed not from violence, but from kindness. The U.S. Army did not do this out of weakness. They did it because they understood that victory came not only from weapons, but from the ability to remain human. Even when propaganda called them demons, they still sang, and they still allowed the enemy to be human. And when an ideology is confronted with genuine compassion, it begins to rot from within. But this was still not what truly terrified the German officers. Because just a few weeks later, the prisoners would be taken to work in places that silenced them completely. Food factories, mechanized farms, and assembly lines where women and black teenagers operated technology Germany had never seen. Monday, May 15th, 1944, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The air was heavy and humid. Cicadas hummed endlessly in the pine trees that surrounded the rows of weathered wooden barracks. Inside an old room converted into a classroom, 20 German soldiers sat neatly in rows. Standing before a chalkboard was an elderly man with silver hair and steel-rimmed glasses. Professor Abraham Feinstein, a Jewish nuclear physicist who had taught at the University of Vienna before fleeing the Nazis. A young officer, Lieutenant Wilhelm von Braun, sat in the front row, his eyes fixed on the English textbook titled Atomic Structure and Quantum Mechanics. No one spoke. The air was taut, almost vibrating. They were not just studying physics. They were learning from a man their ideology had once sought to eradicate. The U.S. Army's Education and Reorientation Program had begun in late 1943. In partnership with universities such as LSU, Princeton, and even Harvard, courses were offered right inside the camps. From English and American history to science, philosophy, and even the art of free debate. Some of the professors were Jewish refugees. Others were former German academics who had opposed the Nazis. Books were supplied by military libraries. Some classes even had projectors and simple physics experiments. Many prisoners' initial reaction was suspicion. They believed this was psychological warfare. But after a few lessons, what they felt was not indoctrination. It was the quiet collapse of everything they had believed. In a philosophy class, when asked, "What is freedom?" one soldier sat in silence for a long time before replying, "I do not know anymore." Compared to Nazi education, where students were taught about eugenics, racial theory, and absolute loyalty, the experience at Camp Ruston was a shock. Here, debate was encouraged, books were uncensored, and the teacher was sometimes the enemy. Wilhelm von Braun would later recall, "I used to think physics existed to serve war. But after 3 months of learning from Professor Feinstein, I understood that science does not belong to any nation." He would become one of the first POWs to apply to remain in the United States after the war. The prisoner education program was never widely publicized, yet it was a crucial part of a deeper strategy, planting the seeds of free thought in those who had once fought against it. And it was in this strange place, inside a prison camp, where enemy and victim sat side by side, that a quiet revolution began. But not everyone was content to watch. Outside the camp gates, a group of far-right politicians had started asking, "Why are we teaching democratic ideals to our enemies?" Huntsville Prisoner Camp, Texas, spring 1944. A group of German prisoners sat lined up inside a small movie room, but not to watch propaganda reels. On the big screen, Scarlett O'Hara walked across burning fields in Gone with the Wind, her eyes fierce as she swore never to go hungry again. There was something in that look that Obergefreiter Karl Brenner, a young sergeant from Hamburg, could not look away from. He wrote in his journal, "I did not understand all the dialogue, but I understood that feeling. She would not be broken." Over 3 years, hundreds of American films were shown on rotation in POW camps, uncensored, unedited, without propaganda narration. Films like The Grapes of Wrath showed Americans struggling through the Great Depression, clashing with their government, migrating in desperation. One German officer asked a guard, "Why are you showing us things that humiliate America?" The guard replied, "Because it is the truth, and we believe telling the truth makes our country stronger." That spirit, the courage to confront one's flaws, first confused many prisoners, then convinced them. They had grown up in a society where everything was portrayed as perfect. Now, they saw a nation that allowed its citizens to criticize, mock, and even condemn their government openly, and still stand firm. Gone with the Wind was a love tragedy, but to these young prisoners, it was a symbol of soft power. A weapon that fired no bullets, yet pierced through the toughest ideological armor. And on those dark nights in the American South, as flickering images danced across concrete walls, a quiet question began to rise. If America dares to tell its most painful stories, without fear, is there anything more formidable than an enemy that can criticize itself? 6:30 a.m., June 7th, 1944, Hereford Camp, Texas. The first rays of sunlight sliced through the mist-covered barbed wire, casting light over the fine red dust. A group of German prisoners gathered around a radio in the mess hall. The old machine, now a razor-sharp blade cutting into their thoughts. The calm, emotionless voice of a British announcer echoed, "Yesterday, Allied forces successfully landed on the beaches of Normandy." Second Lieutenant Helmut Krauss, 26, a veteran of the Eastern Front, wrote in his diary that day, "We sat frozen. No one said a word. Even Sergeant Fisher, who had never lost an argument, just stared at the wall, his hands clenched around his coffee cup. They knew Normandy was not just an invasion. It was a sentence." On that first day alone, over 5,000 warships and 11,000 aircraft were deployed. 160,000 Allied soldiers, nearly the population of an entire German city, stormed the beaches. "I thought of my father," Krauss continued, "who still believed that the German will alone could defeat anyone. But how does a nation will itself against an ocean?" The next day, American soldiers screened a documentary in the mess hall. The grainy black and white footage was enough to stun them. Sherman tanks rolling ashore, American paratroopers falling like rain from the sky, transport ships blanketing the horizon. Another POW, military doctor Dieter Lang, recalled, "When I saw the endless lines of supply trucks, I shivered. Not because of the war, but because of the organization. Every crate, every box of ammunition, every can of fuel, all moved like parts of a colossal machine, crushing everything in its path." Until that moment, many German officers still believed America was a lazy giant, strong only because of its resources. But Normandy showed them a different truth. America did not just have steel, it had rhythm. A near-inhuman synchronization of production, logistics, and combat. Victory, in the end, does not belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who build the supply chains. And when the POWs returned to their dark barracks that night, no one spoke of victory anymore. One man whispered in the darkness, "Perhaps we were wrong before the war even began." But is war ever truly about winning? Or is it simply a countdown to the inevitable? Fort Robinson, POW Camp, Nebraska, April 1945. At dawn, a thin mist still hovered over the ground as a group of German prisoners stepped into a makeshift screening room inside an old warehouse. No one spoke. No one sat close to one another. The light from the projector pierced through a haze of fine dust suspended in the air. On the screen were the first images of the Buchenwald concentration camp, filmed by American soldiers who had just liberated it. They saw piles of bodies stacked like firewood, skeletal survivors with hollow eyes, and rooms with iron hooks hanging from the ceiling, and concrete floors with drainage channels. A young officer, Franz Becker, who had once believed deeply in the honor of the Wehrmacht, wrote in his diary that night, "I could not breathe. Every heartbeat was an explosion in my head. If this is the war I contributed to, then I am no longer human." The documentary had no narration, only the sound of wind hissing into the microphone, the clanging of iron doors, and the faint moans of children from the camp infirmary. Some prisoners vomited. Some tried to look away but were ordered by American officers to keep watching. Some sat in silence, haunted. For the next 2 hours, they were forced to confront something no one had ever taught them back home, that they had not been fighting for an ideal, but for a machine of destruction. In subsequent interrogations, Many POWs admitted it was the first time they had felt ashamed of being German. Some cried. Others panicked, grasping for excuses, trying to deny. But the footage itself was undeniable proof. By May 1945, as the camps at Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz were discovered one by one, the flow of information could no longer be stopped. Photographs, headless corpses, rooms filled with human hair, desperate scratch marks on the walls of gas chambers were handed to each POW with the words, "This is what you fought to protect." For the first time since their capture, they no longer asked, "When will we be released?" But, how did this happen? Many young officers who had once dreamed of glory now saw themselves as silent cogs in a chain of atrocities. The first cracks in Nazi ideology had become an abyss, and from that abyss rose a relentless question. If we ourselves were tools of evil, then what could honor possibly mean? Frankfurt am Main, autumn, 1947. Inside a red brick building still scarred by bomb blasts, a group of men in plain suits quietly arranged chairs and wiped down chalkboards as they prepared for the first meeting of the West German Economic Committee. Among them was Walter Hallstein, a former Wehrmacht officer who had been captured in France and held in a POW camp in Texas, where he had attended political science, economics, and history classes taught by American professors. From a man who once served the Nazi regime, Hallstein was now one of the first architects of the European Economic Community, the organization that would later become the European Union. Not far from there, Hans Kroll, a former prisoner captured in Tunisia, was typing the first draft of West Germany's new diplomatic strategy. He had once worked at the Nazi Foreign Office, but his months as a prisoner in America had exposed him to an entirely different kind of governance. One where democracy was not just a slogan, but a system that actually worked, both efficiently and humanely. After the war, he became ambassador to Moscow and played a pivotal role in stabilizing East-West relations during the early years of the Cold War. And in a small town near Hamburg, Rüdiger von Marx, a former tank lieutenant captured in Italy, was running a new-style agricultural cooperative, applying exactly what he had learned from farms in Texas. "I once thought a combine harvester was a luxury for capitalists," he later recalled. But it was that machine, and American management thinking, that saved our farm from bankruptcy. According to a 1955 report by West Germany's Ministry of the Interior, more than 40,000 former POWs held in the United States had participated in education and reintegration programs. Among them, hundreds went on to hold leadership positions in politics, economics, and education. They brought back not just skills, but a new understanding of press freedom, civil rights, and the separation of powers. Ideas once denounced as Western decadence. Their stories raise a deeper question. Is true victory in war merely about defeating an enemy's army? Or is it when you turn their minds against evil and lead them to choose the light? May 9th, 1945, Hereford POW Camp, Texas. The sky was crystal blue, and a soft breeze carried the scent of dry grass mixed with the smell of freshly baked bread from the kitchen. Wilhelm Hofer, a former Armored Corps lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, sat pensively against a red brick wall, holding a U.S. newspaper with the bold headline, "Victory in Europe. Peace at last." But it was not the headline that held his gaze. It was the photograph beneath it, a young black American woman, smiling brightly, holding a bouquet of flowers as she stood among the victorious troops. "I never knew the world could be like this," he wrote in his diary that night. We were taught that freedom is chaos, but it was precisely that chaos that defeated the empire of discipline. For 3 years living among their so-called mortal enemies, German officers like Wilhelm had witnessed something no slogan had prepared them for. That America's real strength did not come from Sherman tanks or B-17 bombers, but from the library inside the camp, the screening room showing The Grapes of Wrath, the mess hall where a black soldier ladled soup into a German officer's bowl, and no one thought it was remarkable. Hans Kroll, who had once been an advisor to the Nazi Foreign Ministry, later recalled after returning home, "It was in Texas that I learned the true definition of a civilized society, a place where even the enemy is treated as human." Walter Hallstein, who would go on to become the first president of the European Commission, had been a POW attending political science classes in an American camp. And Rüdiger von Marx, once a battalion artillery commander who later helped design West Germany's federal education system, wrote, "I saw the light in the deserts of Texas and the darkness when I returned to Berlin." In those camps, the idea of freedom, once dismissed as weak and chaotic, became the most dangerous weapon of all. No propaganda could match the power of lived reality. No accusation was stronger than showing your enemy that they were still human. If a German prisoner in 1943 could have his worldview changed after a single afternoon watching an American film in the desert, then today, in a world more polarized than ever, can we learn again how to truly listen to an enemy? Would you expect this from a POW camp? Share your thoughts below.